Have you ever wondered why the world keeps borrowing without stopping? Why the same game starts again after every crisis? Right now, the world is living inside a massive financial experiment, and almost no one realizes they are part of it. Take your tea or your coffee, sit back and listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you. Because this story is not about money, it's about who holds the control. This is the world of empires and economies, where money, power, and history collide. If you're ready, let's begin. The greatest experiment in history. This is the greatest financial experiment in human history. And the irony is, most people don't even realize they're living inside it. Today, global debt, whether government, corporate, household, or personal, has reached levels no civilization has ever carried before. Governments borrow trillions as if it were nothing. Central banks create money with a few keystrokes. Families sign 30-year mortgages as casually as buying groceries. And yet, we still talk about debt as if it were something natural, harmless, and permanent. But the truth is far more unsettling. Debt has always been a tool of power, a mechanism of control, and a time bomb waiting for the right spark. The real question isn't whether this enormous mountain of global debt will cause a crisis. The real question is when that crisis will erupt, and who will pay the price when the system resets. To understand how we got here, we need to go back to the very beginning, to the origins of debt itself. The origins of debt. As old as civilization. Debt is as old as civilization itself. Think back to those first clay tablets in Mesopotamia. They weren't covered in poetry or philosophy. They were records of debt. They listed who owed whom, how much grain, how many cattle. From the very beginning, debt was more than economics. It was sacred. Priests and kings oversaw those debts. They set the rules, enforced the payments, and sometimes, during great periods of mercy called jubilees, they erased them all. To stop their societies from collapsing, they wiped every debt clean in a single night. Think about that. Even thousands of years ago, people understood that to keep a society alive, sometimes you had to start over. Debt was power, yes, but too much debt was danger. The rulers of the ancient world knew this well. Something modern leaders seem to have forgotten. You cannot chain an entire people to debt forever. Eventually, the system breaks. The golden age of debt, the Renaissance. Let's fast forward a little. To the Renaissance, when banking families like the Medici rose to power in Florence, debt was no longer about grain or cattle. It had evolved into gold and credit. Kings and popes borrowed enormous sums to wage wars, to build cathedrals, and to expand their empires. But debt was always risky. Even Spain, flooded with silver from the New World, declared bankruptcy 4 times in the 16th century. Because kings had spent far beyond their means. And here lies the first great lesson. Even empires filled with gold can drown in debt when ambition outruns reality. Debt was no longer a personal matter. It had become geopolitical. It financed wars, toppled dynasties, and redrew the maps of the world. The explosion of the century, the birth of modern debt. The modern age of debt began in the 20th century. When the First World War ended, nations were buried under debts so heavy that paying them back seemed impossible. Germany was crushed under the Treaty of Versailles, forced to pay enormous war reparations. The debt was so large that economists of the time warned it would destabilize the country. And they were right. In the early 1920s, Germany fell into chaos. People carried wheelbarrows of banknotes just to buy a loaf of bread. Money lost its meaning within hours. It was the direct result of debts that could never be paid. That crisis didn't just break the economy. It scarred the soul of a nation. And the anger and despair it left behind helped pave the way toward the Second World War. Debt was no longer an entry in a ledger. It had become the fuel of chaos. 1944. Bretton Woods and the rebuilding of the world. By 1944, the foundations of the global economy were being rewritten. The world had survived the war, but it was shattered. And in a quiet New Hampshire town called Bretton Woods, a new financial order was born. This conference became the birthplace of the modern system, and the power behind it was the United States. By the end of the war, America held 2/3 of the world's gold. That meant they could set the rules. The dollar was fixed to gold at $35 per ounce. Other currencies tied themselves to the dollar. On paper, the goal was stability. In reality, it was dependency. From that moment on, every nation's debt, every government bond, every financial calculation rested on faith in America's discipline. For a while, the system worked. Trade expanded, economies grew, and optimism returned. But the desire to borrow, to spend beyond limits, never disappears. By the 1960s, the costs of the Vietnam War and massive domestic programs began to rise. The United States started printing more dollars than it had gold to back them. Other countries noticed. They began demanding gold instead of paper. And in 1971, President Richard Nixon closed the door. The dollar's link to gold was broken for good. 1971, the Silent Revolution. The year 1971 marked a silent but revolutionary turning point. From that moment, debt was no longer limited. It had become infinite. No currency was tied to gold anymore. Governments could borrow as much as they wanted. Central banks could print as much money as they needed. The only limit was trust. With gold gone, central banks discovered new tools. They learned to steer economies through interest rates. When growth slowed, they cut rates to encourage borrowing. When a crisis hit, they created more debt to patch the wounds. Each rescue demanded more leverage than the last. In the 1980s, under leaders like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, public debt exploded. It was justified as defense spending or economic reform. Developing nations borrowed heavily from Western banks. When they couldn't repay, the Latin American debt crisis began. The pattern was set. Chase prosperity through debt, and drown in it when the tide turns. 2008, the mask of debt falls. Then came 2008. Many saw it as a housing crisis, but in truth it was much deeper than that. It was the collapse of a system built on layer after layer of debt. Home loans had been turned into complex financial products. Banks packaged those loans and sold them to investors. Investors insured them. And those insurance contracts were bought and sold again. It was a tower made of sand, built higher and higher by greed. And when one stone slipped, the whole structure came crashing down. Banks failed. Retirement funds vanished. Governments poured trillions into bailouts to keep the system alive. But the cruel irony was this. The very people who broke the system were the ones who got rescued, and the ones who did nothing wrong were the ones who paid the price. Workers lost their jobs. Families lost their homes. Small businesses disappeared. 2008 revealed the truth. Debt was not a neutral tool. It was a system designed to protect the powerful. The rule was simple. If you are strong, you get saved. If you are not, you get left behind. The New Age, the invisible empire of debt. After 2008, the numbers stopped being big. They became unbelievable. In just 2 decades, global debt has tripled. By 2023, the total debt of the world passed $300 trillion. That is nearly 4 times the size of the global economy. Governments, corporations, households, everyone is drowning in it. In Japan, public debt has passed 200% of GDP. In the United States, trillions are added every year, and almost no one seems to notice. Emerging nations borrow in foreign currencies, and when interest rates rise, they find themselves on the edge of collapse overnight. The global economy has turned into a massive balancing act. Its stability depends on the illusion that debt can grow forever without consequence. But debt always has a cost. It changes behavior. It creates bubbles. It transfers wealth upward. And most of all, it changes the future. Every dollar borrowed today is a claim on tomorrow's labor. And the numbers have grown so large that paying them back has become impossible. That is why history is filled with defaults, restructurings, inflations, and crises. Because debt always ends in one of 3 ways. You pay it back honestly, you inflate it away, or you default. No empire, no system has ever escaped that truth. Invisible chains. Today, the consequences of debt are everywhere, yet most people don't see them because debt has become invisible. Think about it. When your government runs a deficit, it doesn't knock on your door for cash. It issues bonds, sells them to banks or foreign investors, and quietly adds the bill in your name. When you swipe your credit card, you are not paying, you are borrowing. When corporations announce record profits, those profits are often fueled by borrowed money used to buy back their own stock. The entire system runs on leverage, and leverage feels like gravity, weightless on the way up, crushing on the way down. Today, the global financial order rests on promises, promises that may never be kept. America and the mirror of debt. Think about the United States, the center of the system. Its national debt passed $34 trillion in 2024. That number is so large most people can't even imagine it. But translate it into reality. Every American taxpayer now carries hundreds of thousands of dollars in obligations. Interest payments alone have grown as large as the defense budget. That means the world's most powerful nation is borrowing money just to pay the interest on the money it already borrowed. And this problem isn't unique to America. Across Europe, countries like Italy and Greece still carry debt-to-GDP ratios well above 100%. In China, the picture is even more complex. Much of the debt is hidden in local governments and state-owned enterprises. The real amount may be far higher than official numbers suggest. Everywhere you look, debt has metastasized. It spreads quietly, filling every corner of the global economy. The psychological trap. This trap is not only financial, it is psychological. Politicians love debt because it buys time. Raising taxes angers voters. Cutting spending angers them even more. But borrowing? That feels painless. Future generations will pay for it anyway. The illusion works until it doesn't. When interest rates rise, everything suddenly becomes visible. Debt stops being an abstract number. It turns into real, painful weight. That is exactly what we witnessed after 2022. Central banks raised interest rates to fight inflation. The result was immediate. Debt costs doubled. Governments began to struggle with their budgets. Families could no longer afford their mortgages. Companies found it impossible to refinance their loans. Debt is like a sleeping predator. Harmless while it rests, but deadly when it awakens. The greatest lie of the modern age. Despite all the risks, debt is still sold as the key to prosperity. Young people are told to take on massive student loans without knowing if they will ever be able to repay them. Families are encouraged to buy homes they can barely afford because real estate always goes up. Nations are told that deficits don't matter because central banks can print unlimited money. And here lies the greatest lie of modern finance. That debt is free, that it is infinite, that it is safe. But history says the opposite. Every age, every empire, every civilization made the same mistake, and every single time it ended the same way. The escape routes. So, what happens next? If you know even a little about economic history, you know there are no easy answers. There are only 3 ways to escape a mountain of debt. The first is inflation, silently eroding the value of what is owed, weakening the currency. This is already happening. When prices rise 10%, your savings lose 10% of their power, but your government's debt shrinks by the same amount. It is a hidden tax, and it is politically easier than default. The second way is restructuring. Admitting the debt cannot be paid and renegotiating the terms. We saw this in Greece when bondholders were forced to take losses so the system could survive. The third way is outright default, simply refusing to pay. History is full of such moments, from Argentina to Russia. Each time it brings turmoil. None of these paths are painless. All of them break a promise. Where the world is headed. So, which path is the world taking now? The signs are clear. Inflation is the preferred choice. Central banks pretend to fight it, but for debt-burdened governments, inflation is a lifeline, because inflation quietly eats away the real value of debt. On paper, everything looks fine. In reality, the cost is passed to the citizens. So, who pays the price? You do. Your savings, your salary, your future purchasing power. All of it slowly drains away to keep the system alive. This is the oldest trick in history. And still, century after century, people fall for it. Because inflation creeps in quietly, numbers feel abstract, and the system trains us to believe that debt is someone else's problem. But in truth, debt is carried on all our shoulders. We just don't realize it. Debt and power. There is one thing we must never forget. Debt is not just about economics. Debt is the mirror of power. It shows who lends, who borrows, and who gets rescued when things collapse. The financial system is built in such a way that when debt becomes unbearable, the powerful almost never pay the price. Banks get bailed out. Corporations restructure. Politicians retire. But ordinary people? They lose their homes. They lose their jobs. They lose their hope. That is why understanding debt is not just financial education. It is survival. If you cannot see the trap, you will live inside it without even knowing you are chained. Real protection and the lesson of history. So, what should we do? First, we have to strip away the illusions. Debt is not neutral. Every dollar borrowed, every line of credit carries a cost. Even if you can't see it, it will be paid eventually. Second, we must recognize the patterns of history. No power has ever survived forever without confronting its debt. Times change, tools evolve, but the ending is always the same. Debt grows, warnings are ignored, and the system collapses. Third, protect yourself. That doesn't mean panic or bearing gold in the backyard. It means focusing on what truly holds value. Trusting not in paper promises, but in things that last. Knowledge that keeps its worth. Skills that endure. An awareness that protects you in every cycle. Because the system will play the same game again. The names will change. The words will change. But the pattern will remain the same. Debt builds. Leaders deny, crises erupt, and societies reset. Your only choice is whether you enter that cycle blind or awake. If you see the traps, you can avoid the chains. If you don't, you'll end up paying for mistakes that weren't yours. Final words, under the shadow. Global debt is not just a number. It is not a dry statistic written on a chart. It is the shadow hanging over our future. And if we fail to learn from history, that shadow will crush us, just as it crushed the empires before us. History has done this many times, and it will do it again because humanity forgets. But for those who remember, there is still hope. Because history is not only a warning, it is also a guide. If this story gave you a new perspective, don't forget to like the video and subscribe, because the answers are already written in history. I'm just here to show you where to look.